All right, good afternoon and welcome to another Capital Live event brought to you by Spotlight PA. I'm Stephen Kears, Assistant Editor at Spotlight PA, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. For those of you who are new to our work or programming, Spotlight PA is an independent, nonpartisan newsroom producing investigative and accountability journalism about the state capitol and urgent statewide issues. We share all of our journalism at no cost with other newsrooms across the state, all part of our mission to better inform and empower all Pennsylvanians. Our work is driven by a deep sense of public service and is powered by you, our readers and members. None of our work, this event, our many newsletters, our investigative journalism, our public service initiatives is possible without your support. We're not like other newsrooms in Pennsylvania. We're blazing a new path forward for collaborative public service journalism supported by the public, serving the public, and reflective of the needs and concerns of the public. So I have an important request today. We need just 15 people to step forward now and make a contribution to Spotlight PA so we can break even on this event and continue our vital coverage. So I'd like to pause here a moment and ask anyone who has the means to please make a gift now at spotlightpa.org/donate. That's spotlightpa.org/donate. Your contributions help us keep this programming free and available to all. We use the honor system. If you're here today and you value this work and you can afford to help support it, we need your help. So again, as we introduce today's event, please take a moment and give now at spotlightpa.org/donate. If you're already a member, thank you. You've helped make all of this work possible. Lastly, housekeeping. We are recording today's event to share with those who couldn't make it. Thank you to everyone who sent questions in advance. If you have not yet asked a question, you can do so using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the toolbar here on the screen. We will get to as many questions as we can toward the end of our event. Now I'm going to turn things over to our investigative reporter, Angela Columbus.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Columbus, and I'm an investigative reporter with Spotlight PA covering the state capitol. Thank you for joining this panel on what is a critical topic now before our state Supreme Court, and that is the future of Pennsylvania's no excuse vote by mail law. Just a little bit of background. In 2019, the state legislature passed what came to be known as Act 77. The law was passed with bipartisan support, and at the time was hailed as ushering in some of the most significant changes to Pennsylvania's election laws in decades. Among other things, the law allowed registered voters for the first time to cast ballots from the convenience of their home in every election, whether that be primary, general, or special, without having to provide an excuse for why they couldn't make it to the polls on election day. It was to go into effect for the first time during elections in 2020, but what no one predicted when it passed was that we would be in the thick of a pandemic, and that no excuse mail ballots would also become a political hot potato in the midst of one of the most divisive presidential elections in modern history. After the 2020 election, there were numerous court challenges involving mail ballots and their role in the election's outcome, none of them successful. Last year, a group of Republican lawmakers, as well as a Republican county commissioner, challenged the law's constitutionality in the state's Commonwealth Court. That appellate court last month agreed that the way in which the law was passed through the traditional process of approving legislation went contrary to the state constitution, and that instead no excuse mail voting necessitated a constitutional amendment, which is a lengthy process in which voters have the final say. The Wolf administration immediately appealed that decision, and the matter is now before the state Supreme Court. Here to talk to us today about the law and its future are Philadelphia City Commissioner Omar Sabir, whose office oversees elections in Philadelphia, the largest county in the state; Ray Murphy, state coordinator for Keystone Votes, a nonpartisan coalition of 41 organizations that work to make voting more accessible and secure. He also serves as deputy director of Pennsylvania Voice, a partnership of more than 30 organizations seeking to empower communities of color. And State Rep Dan Mal, a Republican whose district covers parts of Adams County. Representative Mao is among the lawmakers who have sued over the constitutionality of no excuse mail voting. So we have a lot of questions, and I'm going to try and get through mine very quickly so we can get to audience ones as well. Ray, I'm going to start with you. I'm hoping you could give us a brief overview of Act 77, including some of its key provisions and its path through the legislature.
Sure. So I work for a coalition of organizations that do everything from directly work with and educate voters about upcoming issues to policy experts and legal experts, ACLU, Common Cause, a whole bunch of groups like that. Act 77 was the first time that all voters were allowed to vote by mail. That was the most significant provision of Act 77. It allowed any voter in the Commonwealth to be able to cast a ballot using the mail, very much like the absentee voting system that was already in place, but without any need to say that you were out of town for work or because of a disability. There were other political compromises that were made in the bill, and some were minor election code changes, including a change to the voter registration deadline. And then a big moment of debate was about the elimination of straight ticket voting, which is when a voter gets to pick one button that votes for all of the Democrats or all of the Republicans who are running in that race. It was passed in October of 2019, and it was only passed because of a bipartisan compromise between Democrat Governor Wolf and then Republican Speaker and President in the Senate, who have changed since then, but ultimately both chambers are controlled by Republicans. And that's really the story of vote by mail. It was a great victory for everybody in the state who wanted to see a modern and more accessible election system.
Representative Mao, how did you vote on Act 77 at the time? And did you or any of your colleagues or even legislative staffers raise constitutional concerns about the way it was being implemented?
Okay, here I'll try and put this all in a box for you so you understand it, how it all came about. Act 7, it was actually Senate Bill 421 was brought to us. It's actually a Senate Democrats bill, and they loaded into it the mail-in voting, which became Act 77. As it left the House of Representatives and headed to the governor's desk or back to the Senate for, I'm not sure if that one had to go back to the Senate to be approved, but either way, the way it went to the governor's desk was a decent bill. And at the time, nor I nor anyone else thought to go read our Constitution to see if it was constitutional. We have a legal staff that would have warned us if they thought it was unconstitutional. Nobody had mentioned anything about that part. However, once it got to the governor's office, he signed it immediately, approving the bill, and then turned around and petitioned the Supreme Court to change the bill. And when they changed the bill, very unconstitutionally changed the bill, very illegally changed the bill, they took out the safeguards that were built into the bill. They took out, they added drop boxes, made them part of the bill, allowed drop boxes, which they aren't allowed by our election code. They aren't in this bill. They added 3 extra days to vote. They did away with signature match, and they non-postmarked ballots were allowed. These then made the security. These were the security measures of the bill, and they removed them. And I say illegally and unconstitutionally made these changes. That's outside the scope of their authority as the Supreme Court. So I voted on the bill the way it was as Senate Bill 421 presented to us in the House. Had that bill have been presented to us in the House with what the Supreme Court did, it wouldn't even have come up for a vote. Okay, so that's how much damage they did to it. And it would not only would it not, if it would have come up for a vote, it would have failed immediately. But we didn't vote on the bill in its form after the Supreme Court got a hold of it and what I call bastardizing the bill. They didn't have the authority to do so.
We'll get to this in a little bit as well, but I just wanted to quickly follow up with that. The challenge that, or the issue now before the Supreme Court doesn't have to do with the things that you mentioned. It has, which is drop boxes, which were litigated in 2020 and unsuccessfly litigated.
By the same people that said you could do it. I get that. The way it came to be is not too awful long ago, one of our new members who is a constitutional scholar, he's one of the 14 that got together. He brought to our attention that if you read Article 7, Section 14 of the Constitution that talks about absentee voting, it pretty clearly states in there, there's only two ways to vote. That's absentee with an excuse, and it lists what the excuses are that you can use as absentee voting or in person. It says nothing, it does not address mail-in voting. No excuse mail-in voting. So
we're going to get to that.
Okay.
We're definitely going to get to that. But before we do, I wanted to ask you, Commissioner Sabir, I mean, just if you could walk us through, generally speaking, from the county perspective, how much preparation went into getting ready for no excuse mail ballots. And, you know, if you could also touch a little bit on how Act 77 has changed voting in Philadelphia County. You know, have you seen it increase voter participation and turnout?
Yes, sir. First, I'd like to say thank you for having me. But yes, for Act 77, I guess you could think of it as like a hurricane. You know, what's the biggest hurricane we had that hit New Orleans? It just was like a whirlwind, right? And it was my first election. So I got elected in 2019. So that was actually my first one, the primary general in 2020. And we had to purchase new equipment. We had to acquire more space. We had to hire additional employees. We had to change our messaging up. We had to do press. And the interesting thing about Act 77, was a lot of people don't understand, is that it was a change to the county officials across the state, but we didn't have any additional resources. There wasn't no additional appropriation that came from the state. And our constituents, you know, they were confused. And it was like a challenge having to build up the belief that you actually can vote by mail and there was nothing wrong. And we also had to have, you know, just additional information about, you know, just voting. I mean, the space. I mean, for the 2020 election, we had to secure the Pennsylvania Convention Center. And that was just in a matter of just a couple of months to actually do the canvassing process. We had national, international attention. So it just was so much that was going on from the way how we voted. And the beautiful thing about it is it opened up doors for people that couldn't vote. There were some constituents that were actually sick, shut in, and could not vote. So Act 77 opened up some doors, but again, we had to do stuff with our social media, radio commercials, canvassing. We had to do strategic partnerships in supermarkets. I mean, it was just because people wasn't trusting the media. So we actually had to go into the communities and partner up with clergy, trusted messaging with people. And it was just one big challenge. I mean, but overall, you know, voter turnout increased because again, you know, there were some people that wouldn't have voted if they didn't have Act 77 and the universal no excuse vote by mail stretched out the deadlines because we had issues with the postal service. So if you know, just the way how absentees were set up before, the time that it would take us to mail you, for you to apply for your no excuse, for your absentee ballot, for us to mail it out to you and for us to get it back, it was challenging for people to vote. So the universal vote opened up a lot of doors, and hope that we can keep it. I hope that we can keep it because we're going to have to do so much messaging again to go back and tell you it was a different way, and not just the vote by mail. You had street party chicken, the nominated petitions, the in-person absentee vote, and it's just so much stuff that we're going to have to go back and do for our constituents. And our budgets on a county level, you know, it was already under budgeted. You know, nobody never really placed a high priority on election board budgets. And it'd just be a big mess, in the words of some of my constituents.
Representative Mel, I want to come back to you because you started talking a little bit about what triggered your change of heart and your decision to participate in the lawsuit. But I'm hoping you can also address the elephant in the room here, and that is, was this lawsuit in any way motivated by former President Donald Trump's legally unfounded position that there was widespread fraud during last year's election and that the election was stolen from him, or to help bolster a potential run by him in 2024?
Absolutely not. We're definitely not trying to rewrite history here. We just see something that was done illegally by the Supreme Court, and I'm ready to argue that with anybody. They changed what we sent them and made it, and I want to clarify this. We didn't audit anything. We didn't have police standing there to catch people cheating, but they made it so easy to cheat if you want to cheat by taking all the security measures out of it. I will say this. If the Supreme Court, under the governor's ask, would have left it alone just the way it was when he signed it into law, okay, which is a whole nother conversation of why did the governor sign it if he didn't like it the way it was? Why did he petition the court to change it? But that's a whole nother conversation we can have. But had they have left it alone, we would have probably had a decent mail-in voting system in place that we could have tweaked as we went along to help the counties out by giving them more days ahead of time to start getting the envelopes open and things like that. And we probably wouldn't be here today. We probably would have thought, okay, finally we put people over politics and gave our people in our communities what they wanted. They didn't want to stand in line for 3 hours to vote. So to get back to your original question, has nothing to do with Donald Trump, past or future. Personally, I don't think he's running again. I would bet not, but that's not my business. But in any event, it has nothing to do with him. Zero. Absolutely zero. Has to do with the fact that the bill was changed by a Supreme Court that didn't have the authority to change it. And when we started looking at, well, what does the Constitution say? Oh my God, well, right here it says, you can't even do mail-in voting. So in order to take that away so that we can possibly pass something that is better, that the Supreme, and we'd have to do it in the Constitution to keep the Supreme Court from screwing with it, okay? And unfortunately, that's where we're at these days. So the only way to do this is to have it declared unconstitutional by our Constitution, and the Commonwealth Court agrees with us. The 52-page, very well written decision on this, and it's pretty tough to argue with their decision. So let's go back to zero and start over.
Ray, I want to go back to you here for a second, because I'm hoping you can clarify for everybody here what the issue is before the Supreme Court precisely. And is it about drop boxes? Is it about Dropbox security, or is it about something completely different? And then can you also, while you're at it, walk us through, if you can, the Commonwealth Court's rationale for finding the mail ballot portion of Act 77 unconstitutional? Is the state constitution clear on this issue? And also one last thing, several audience members have asked this question. Does this, did the Commonwealth Court ruling affect other elements of Act 77, in particular, the disallowing of party line voting?
Those are a lot of things, Angela. You might have to come back and ping me on some specifics if I don't get them all. I guess I would start by saying that I kind of have a slightly different memory of how vote by mail emerged in Pennsylvania. I personally participated in conversations with both advocates, folks from the Department of State, Republican House staff, Republican Senate staff and actually, I didn't actually speak to anyone on the Democratic House staff that early, because frankly, it was really about whether or not members of the Republican caucus wanted vote by mail in the state. And I don't think we have time to do like a Harrisburg in a nutshell, but the majority sort of makes the major decisions about which bills move forward in our state. Those conversations started, and particularly the Senate State Government Committee, Republican staff, convened a number over many months of large meetings with election directors from as many counties as around the state as possible, as well as the County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania, which are both the organizations that actually run elections the most clearly in the way that our jurisdictional authority exists in the state of Pennsylvania. And those conversations went on for years. And one of the most important questions that was, so between 2015 and 2019, when the law was passed, the biggest conversation was, is it allowable in the Pennsylvania state constitution to have vote by mail without explicit authority in the Pennsylvania state constitution? And I don't know if folks really want to hear the whole history lesson, but basically absentee voting only became into existence during the Civil War, because there were no, remember, this is only when white men were the only people allowed to vote too, but it came into existence during the Civil War because there were a lot of soldiers from Pennsylvania who were fighting down south and wanted to vote by absentee. It was eventually codified into the Constitution, but the ultimate thing we're looking at that we still run election laws on in Pennsylvania is from 1937. And that's almost 100 years ago that we're basing our laws on in Pennsylvania. And what the interpretation of, and this is the part I would sort of just refute a little bit, something you said earlier, Representative, I know for a fact that Republican legal staff reviewed the Constitution. And in fact, there's sort of inside detail. The original plan was to have no excuse absentee voting. It was Republican legal staff who decided that that term was risky because of the interpretation of the Constitution. And they created a new class called vote by mail voters. But it was still based on an interpretation of the Constitution, which essentially said there are a few specific groups of voters in the state who have to be able to be allowed to vote by absentee voting, but the Constitution never ever says that there's a limit on either the administration or even the legislature by statutory authority saying that there are other classes they would add. I would also mention that we have a couple of classes of voters now who vote allowably by absentee voting, not even by vote by mail, who the Constitution doesn't explicitly name. The most interesting example to me is the spouses of members of active military. In Pennsylvania, a spouse of someone in the military can request an absentee ballot, which, remember, would exist even if Act 77 was struck down. However, based on the constitutional arguments that are being used to take apart the vote by mail law, it would also mean we'd have to strictly only allow absentee voting to the explicit classes named in the current Pennsylvania Constitution. So as you can imagine, it took 4 years to come up with a compromise because there's a lot of thorny issues here, but a compromise was achieved, and it was before the pandemic. Republican leaders in our state legislature signed off on Act 77. And I would politely disagree that I don't think the courts have the ability to rewrite a piece of statutory authority passed by an assembly. The law didn't change. There were some operational challenges. And as Commissioner Sabir mentioned, and frankly, Commissioner Sabir, you should take a lot more credit. It was an enormous undertaking for counties who had no funding, and not just in Philadelphia County, which is the largest, but even the smallest counties who operate with 1.5 full-time election employees. It was absolutely a challenge in any circumstances, but then times a million because of the pandemic. So 3 million people voted using absentee ballots, vote by mail ballots in 2020. Our counties pulled it off, even though it was really tough. And now vote by mail is an obvious update to our Pennsylvania election rules. I see no reason that we're sitting here in 2022 talking about eliminating an option to vote that's been the majority way that people vote in most states in the country that started in the 70s. Vote by mail is trusted, it's reliable, it's safe, and it ultimately will save counties money and make voting more accessible for everybody.
But Ray, just a follow-up question. Since the actual lawsuit really is about process, right? It's about how Act 77 came into existence. There is a section in the state constitution that states that voting requires the physical presence of the elector, and it also sets very specific reasons for when voters can vote by by absentee ballot, such as an illness, for instance. And it doesn't explicitly allow for no excuse mail voting. So isn't there a valid argument to be made that such a change to the law requires amending the Constitution to make it
Absolutely,
clear?
Angela. But here, and this, let me just be clear on what I said earlier. It took 4 years, mostly driven by Republicans in Pennsylvania's legislature who wanted to make vote by mail happen. It took 4 years to figure it out, but a bunch of smart lawyers in a bunch of different quarters said there is a very clear reason why the vote by mail law that we passed works. And it's actually good in the long run that it is being heard by the Supreme Court, because some of what's at issue is some silly rulings from like the 1920s. And I'm not a lawyer, seriously, like I can't even, represent myself as one, but the Supreme Court does need to hear out the different sides, but everybody signed off on it before there was a pandemic. There's some things that got sticky with the pandemic and implementation that would have been a lot different if everyone didn't have a whole other job they were doing, right? And all of us were in that situation, but that's where we're at. So I'm glad the Supreme Court's going to hear it. I find it highly unlikely that vote by mail will be overturned by the Supreme Court. And I think the recent comments from the Commonwealth Court just put us in a bad position where all it feels like is just background noise that says, don't vote, this thing's not going to happen, trying to disparage once again the integrity of our election system at a time when we really need everybody to rally around together.
Commissioner Sabir, are the city commissioners participating in the appeal of the Act 77 ruling now before the Supreme Court? And can you explain, the position and why the office decided to participate in that?
Yes, 2 weeks ago, our office, we unanimously approved us filing an amicus brief with the Supreme Court. And, and it's basically just to make it just shorter, it's like for us, for one, if, again, we talked about the challenges that we had earlier with purchasing equipment. We purchased millions of dollars of equipment. We then had to secure hundreds of thousands of extra space so that we could fit the equipment there. So we're basically essentially running 2 offices. And it would definitely be, it'd be a problem if the Supreme Court would take it away. It's just like, it would just take it away. It'd just be hard for us. And so we filed, our legal team actually filed it. And the basic principles is, it would hurt our elections the way how we have administrated. We talk about the trust that people have in elections. When Act 77 came, some of our constituents were voting a certain way for 60 years consecutively. And, some of the African-American voters, when they see these different changes and things like that, that makes them not want to participate in the election process. So you got one change, and then you want to come back again and do another change. And that is almost like voter suppression, because once there is no confidence in the system, people are going to typically back up and break away from the election process. And so we want to make voting accessible for people. And that's what we want to do from county commissioner's standpoint. And our legal team, I definitely filed something, and hopefully it will make an impact, but it definitely would hurt us in our ability to try to administer a great election that the public has trust in if Act 77 was repealed.
Commissioner, one quick follow-up question for you. I mean, has there been from a county perspective, right? Has there been any immediate impact on your office's operations because of the Commonwealth Court decision? Are you making contingency plans? Are you proceeding as normal? And how are you dealing with voters who may be calling in concerned about how to proceed?
Literally, someone, the constituent knocked on my door and said, I want a nominating petition because I want to run for a committee person. And, Philadelphia, we have 1,700 divisions. Committee person is a big race, for our precincts. And she knocked on the door. I mean, she was a voter. She voted for about 40, 50 years. And she said, where's the petitions at? And I was explaining to her that, hey, Supreme Court, suspended everything. We have to wait for the Supreme Court, with the lawsuit. And I was explaining everything to her. But the look in her face was like, man, what is this what are y'all doing? Are you doing something funny with my vote? Like, y'all want my petitions. And, and as we do all these different changes with the lawsuits, our office doesn't have resources to do a campaign, a TV campaign, and say, oh, this isn't true, here are the rules. So when these changes happen, some people typically just take it as being fact. Like, there's some people walking around saying that, hey, Act 77 and vote by mail is unconstitutional. I said it was just a lawsuit being filed. We have to wait to the Supreme Court says. But, that's just been a challenge. And even just for the last year, all of those other lawsuits, right? It takes time away from us, administering elections, dealing with frivolous lawsuits, in my opinion. So, I mean, it's a challenge. And, but, we're still telling our constituents to apply for their vote by mail. We're trying to operate, normal. But again, right now, people are confused. People are frustrated with this. They just want us to get it right. And we have to keep coming back over and over, telling them over and over again. Just imagine if we told them that election day wasn't May 17th. We got so much literature already printed up with May 17th on it. Now for us to go back again and then print it up again and say, oh no, election day might be another day. So hopefully, we keep election day the same day. I mean, this is my wish. Election day, will be the same day. I understand, the date's going to change with the petitions. And that would be, pretty good compromise, from my perspective. But again, it's constant work. And like I say, we're constantly under attack. And then, the voters' confidence, that's my real concern, because some people are just fed up and saying, hey, you know what, to hell with voting. I'm not voting. Y'all confused. Y'all know what's going on. And it's not really our fault. But again, that could be the intention of some of these lawsuits. I mean, I don't really know. But ultimately, I mean, it's really driving people to not want to participate in the election process, especially the younger voters 18 to 35. They express this sentiment to our office.
I want to throw this question out to all panelists, and then I will, because I see there's a lot of comments in the chat and in the Q&A, I want to try and turn quickly to audience questions. But for all panelists, and we'll start with you, Representative Mao, like, how do you respond to people who are skeptical that this lawsuit is little more than an underhanded attempt to thwart Democratic voters, including many in Black and Brown communities, from casting ballots?
Well, okay, that's ridiculous to even think that. We've been on the forefront stating right from the very beginning that we want every legal American citizen to vote, every single one, and we want their vote to be counted. We want no votes that don't belong on in the elections office. We want no illegal votes to be there, okay? We've said that all along. Has nothing to do with party. I think I read that little piece right up front and said, this was a win for people, not politics. And if it was, and I'm going to hold something up so that everybody, you won't be able to read it, but this is a vote sheet from that day. Okay. Have you see all the red votes? Those are no votes for this, what became Act 77. Those are all Democrat votes. The green ones on this side are all Republican votes. The Republicans are the ones that put Act 77 where it is. If we wanted to disenfranchise people, why would we have done this? We saw something that could help people of all races and colors and creeds and religions, and said, this will help ease the pain, and the people want it, let's do it. But what actually turned out to be Act 77 after the Supreme Court was done with it was not what we wanted. And we're the ones that make laws. And contrary to what Ray Murphy just said, I don't care how much you like something or how well you think it works. The law is the law. And when we looked at it and said, how do we get rid of the drop boxes? How do we put the security measures back in it, back in Act 77 that were taken out very illegally by our Supreme Court? Well, let's take a look at the Constitution, see what it says. Oh, by the way, the Constitution says that's not legal. And somebody wrote in a little while ago and says, well, it doesn't say you can't do it. Well, it doesn't say you can't drop them out of a helicopter either, but I don't think that Omar Sabir would take ballots that are being dropped out of a helicopter. The law is the law. What it says is what it says, and we want it right, and we want everyone that's legal to vote to cast one vote and have it be counted.
Ray, I'm hoping you can also respond to this as well. The same question, which is, how do you respond to people who are skeptical that this lawsuit is little more than an underhanded attempt to thwart Democratic votes?
Well, I mean, I guess I start by naming that I also know a lot of people who frame the question a little bit differently and say, is this an effort to specifically thwart voters of color who are not necessarily Democratic voters? I think the other thing that I find kind of interesting, and just another way to answer, just to frame the question even, is in the last election, in the 2021 general election, which a lot less people voted, right, than in 2022, typically a year after a president general or primary, pretty low turnout elections. But in 2021, of the Republicans who voted by mail, because Republicans do use vote by mail in the state of Pennsylvania, they're just not using it as much as Democrats. And the question, of course, is why? And I think we all know why, right? I mean, I don't think it's a lifestyle difference. Like, everybody likes the convenience, as someone's been saying in the chat. Like, there's a million stories about how convenient it is to be able to vote and know your vote is cast in advance and do it on your timeline and on your schedule. And that's why so many people like vote by mail. So there are a significant number of Republicans who vote by mail, not as many as Democrats by far. But here's the interesting thing. Both Republicans and Democrats who vote by mail, typically a great number of them are 65 and older. And so one thing, I also kind of throw into the mix, like, is this an attempt to disenfranchise Democratic voters? Is it about people of color? Is it about older voters? I don't know. I don't really understand it myself. And again, I just kind of keep going back to this. There were a lot of people, like dozens, more than 50, right? Like, when you think of all the different state reps, state senators, all the different advocates, members of the governor's staff, all the staff of everybody who were talking about vote by mail for years in the state capitol before we got to 2019 and its actual passage. And they worked through a lot of these legalities, and they worked through who it would advantage and who it would disadvantage. And in that process, I personally just met a lot of people who really did express an interest in updating and improving our election code. But all that's being held hostage now, because all we're doing in the legislature and now in the courts is relitigating the 2020 election over and over again.
No.
I don't understand it.
Okay, well, let me ask a question actually from the audience. It's from Sue W. Have there been verified instances of voting fraud through the mail? How many? And is there a cost advantage for Pennsylvania taxpayers either way, either mail-in or in person? Commissioner, if you want to take a crack at that, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Sure. So our budget actually about doubled with the implementation of the vote by mail. But it's still an expensive process. You may lose work with the staff, but to actually do the processing, the equipment, the consultants to run it, the software. This is very expensive. But it's easier because it expands to allow more people to vote. Since Act 77 was developed and took into law, 600,000, little under 600,000 Philadelphian ballots were cast by mail. And if we look at that, again, we got to count on the people that's in the senior homes, who wasn't ever going to come out for the pandemic, that still have a phobia about coming outside of their house. And but it's definitely it costs more. When we seen that everything just went up.
Mm-hmm.
And even with the supply chains, we're ordering paper and things like that. It's a very expensive process. It costs more. We have to do more mailings to our constituents. You got to mail to 1 million potential voters in your county. It's just exploding. So it costs more. It is going to cost taxpayers more, but the convenience, I think, is something that can't be unmatched. If you talk about a voter who may have been voting for 60 years straight, 70 years straight, who had grandparents or parents who may have been life have been threatened or even taken for voting. They may have migrated from the South. So voting is very important. So, I mean, it definitely keeps the doors open for our seniors and people that are confined to the house.
Okay. Before we get to another audience question, I just wanted to, because I see there's a lot of confusion in the chat. I want to make this clear to people, and either Representative Mal or Ray, please feel free to answer it. This specific lawsuit has nothing to do with drop boxes. It has to do with the process with which Act 77 was put into place. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay. All right. Because there has been a lot of talk about drop boxes and prior lawsuits which were not successful involving them, among other things. I just wanted to make that clear to anybody in the audience who might be confused by its mention here today. So we have a question from Marge O. If any of you know, on what grounds did the Wolf administration appeal the Commonwealth Court's decision that no excuse mail-in ballots are unconstitutional? I don't know, Representative, if you can answer that question, since you're a part of the lawsuit and have.
Yeah, I did not read his appeal. I just know that he filed it, but I did not read his appeal. I don't know what grounds they could have come up with as for the appeal. I know the end game is to get it over to the Supreme Court, where he has very friendly people that work with him very well. You know, that's the end game. The grounds that they used, the Judge Levitt wrote a 52-page report that many in the legal profession and constitutional scholars have said one of the most well-written decisions they've ever read, very thoroughly researched. And she comes out and says very clearly, you can do this, but you have to change it in the Constitution. That I didn't even realize she was going to go that far and say you have to. I thought she'd just come up with it's not constitutional by Article 7, Section 14. But she went into detail. I don't know what he could have, his staff could have come up with to say, this is why she's wrong.
Okay. There's a question from Mary E. and Ray. I hope you can tackle this one. Given that Act 77 was voted on in the General Assembly by quite a decisive margin in both parties, and the General Assembly represents the voters of Pennsylvania, can we expect the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania to overturn the decision of the Commonwealth Court easily? Might they make a few changes? Do you see any scenario where they could actually uphold the decision based on a legal glitch?
No, I mean, quite bluntly, I don't think this decision is either ruling will be focused on a detail or a glitch. At the end of the day, it's going to be about an interpretation of what you think the state constitution allows, which, again, I am not a lawyer, but I've watched enough movies to know that constitutional law is like a thing people really talk about in great depth and with much subtlety and nuance. And I'm not trying to be flippant saying that, but constitutional issues really are complicated and they depend on your interpretation of the law. That's my outside of observation as a non-lawyer of how the process works. And the state Supreme Court is the ultimate decision-making body for state law in Pennsylvania. My understanding is that this case isn't in a position where it could ever go to the US Supreme Court. I mean, never say never, but basically the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which is going to be taking initial testimony on this case in the next few weeks, they're the ones who make the final decision. I almost hate to go into the details about it because I think it is ultimately something that just confuses voters. As Commissioner Sabir said earlier, and I see a number of people said in the chat, there's been a lot of changes to Pennsylvania election law in a very short period of time. And a lot of it has come from lawsuits that do seem politically motivated. And I think that's on both sides of the aisle, certainly in 2020 and during the general election.
Can I ask a question here?
Sure.
Actually, I'd like to ask the questions, but and at the end, I'll, if somebody wants to say something in addition, that would be, obviously welcomed.
I
But
can
we
wrap my
have-
comment up, Angela. Bottom line is the Supreme Court makes a decision on this particular case, and it's up to them to figure out when they want to make that decision. And I would be very surprised if they didn't make sure that a stay was in place, meaning that the elimination of vote by mail is not going to happen until the Supreme Court says so. And they're going to take their time doing that because they're the Supreme Court.
And again, that brings me back to you, Commissioner, because I see in the chat as well that there's still a lot of sort of angst over this. Like, I guess, when the Commonwealth Court issued its decision, it said mail-in voting will be discontinued, but obviously now it's at the Supreme Court level. What do you tell voters who say, like, can I wait to make a decision as to whether I'm going to vote by mail or vote in person?
Well, so the one thing what we always encourage is that, you have to make a plan. That's one of our messaging things. We say, listen, voting is different now, so you have to make a plan. And we try to just really just keep the, emotional upliftment up. Because talking to some younger voters, particularly younger voters, 18 to 35, that's where I spend a lot of my outreach at. And sometimes their hope is just not inside the process. And when you see in those sophisticated disinformation campaigns that are currently happening, going on, and even the lawsuits, I mean, it's all part of marketing, which I believe. And this big confusion that's going on, we have to come out, do strategic planning, but we actually have to get information out. But then also we have to partner up with clergy. We also have to partner with trusted messengers that people trust, because sometimes they don't believe the regular information that I'm handing them. So I guess what? I'm sitting up here, with your clergy member, and we're talking about, voting, because voting is a different experience, especially in the African-American community that been through so much just to have a vote. So from 1871, from Octavius Cotto being assassinated in Philadelphia for elections, to Medgar Evers, to Dr. Martin Luther King, it's one of those things that just sit inside the back of our brain. So when we come and vote, it's a different experience. So, things being taken away, some people just don't have the hope. So we actually have to build up the hope first. And that's what we do. We go to supermarkets, we go, any place that would listen to us. We go there first to bring up the hope and tell them, about the past and history. And then we kind of get into, the laws. But then again, our budget never was increased. That's the interesting thing. County board officials from across the state, our budgets never got increased. All of these changes that we're talking about, purchasing new space, purchasing new equipment, hiring new staff, hiring new consultants, we never once got a budget increase from the state. And, we was fortunate enough to get a grant, but, as an elected official, why should we have to, get a grant? Or why should we have to, make all these changes from the county level when the state made the changes? So with all these changes and everything that's going on, that's kind of like the life of a county official trying to explain to people, all these recent changes. And then we have to talk to our seniors, like our seniors, like I said, who've been voting a certain way 60, 70 years consecutively, and then come back around and tell them, hey, listen, you can't vote like this no more. You can't, it's a lot, but I think that we will be successful in it. I think that there needs to be a serious investment as soon as that Supreme Court ruling comes out, what the rules are, that, all county administrators from all across the state receive resources so that we can get the message out. And then these trusted, platforms, the grassroots organizations, of course, it's always the churches, it's the people at the supermarket, the employees, it's everybody that's going to listen from the grassroots level. We can get the message and the word out there.
All right, Representative Mel, back to you. There's a question for you from Jody M. There are several bills in the legislature to restore those security measures that Representative Mel claims were wiped out. Why aren't Republicans concentrating on these bills rather than trying to overturn mail-in voting altogether?
There's this gentleman up here that we call the governor. And he's the guy that's got to sign bills into law. So even though we could pass that bill over to his desk, he's still the one that petitioned the Supreme Court, along with the disgraced Secretary of State Bookvar, who got fired. They went over to the Supreme Court and had the Supreme Court take those safeguards out. So for us to pass a bill to his desk asking him to put them back in would be kind of futile. It would be a big veto the instant his desk. You don't get things done up here without some sort of an agreement and green lights along the way. That would be a big red light. So to pass it would be just wasting our time without an agreement in place. And he's never going to agree to that. Why? I don't know. I'd like to ask a question of everybody on the panel. Who thinks that we should have secure and safe elections? Everybody's hand should go up. Who feels that putting a drop box out on a street corner that's unattended 24 hours a day is a way to put your ballot in that anybody can get to? That's not very secure. Why did they do that? Why did they take out the signature match? Why did they do that? I would think that's a security measure you'd want in. If you go in to vote in person, you're supposed to sign the book right under your original signature, and the two are supposed to match. Did we put those safeguards in? Why did you take them out?
Those aren't the issues now before the Supreme Court.
You asked about them. You just asked the question, why didn't we pass the bills to put the safeguards in? I just answered it.
That those are not the issues now before the Supreme Court. Is that correct? And they're not the issues that are at
right,
issue.
But I answered the question that you asked, and I'll go ahead and I'll answer the Supreme Court question. No matter if you like to drive, for those that said we like it and the staff worked on it for years and all this, if you like to drive down the road at 70 miles an hour and you've been doing it for years and you get pulled over and the cop says, hey, the speed limit's 55. Yeah, but all these people drive 70. You know something? The law is the law, and it's the speed limit's 55. When you look in this little book here called the Constitution of Pennsylvania, under Article 7, Chapter 4, or Section 14, the law is the law. When we discovered that, hey, we shouldn't have done this in the first place, well, how do we get those safeguards back in? We just cancel it and start over. And we filed the lawsuit, and we were found to be correct about this. So
there's another question for you, actually, Representative Mel.
Sure.
Since voting by no excuse mail-in ballot is so popular, will you introduce and support legislation to amend the PA Constitution to allow for no excuse mail-in voting?
We did it once, remember? All these yes votes for mail-in voting, okay? And if I don't even know, that might be already a bill somebody might have, but you know, I would want to make sure, 100% sure, that it has the safeguards in language that can't be misinterpreted by anyone, even by a sixth grader. It would have to be written that way, and I would probably support it because I heard it in my own district. People don't want to have to stand in line for 2 to 3 hours to vote in a presidential election. I get that. But there's got to be safeguards in place to make sure it is safe and secure, free and fair. And when they took the safeguards out, it didn't make it safe or secure anymore. So the only way that we can attack this is take it, get rid of it, because it wasn't constitutional. And if you want to change the law, just like Judge Levitt said, we go ahead and change it in the Constitution. And I would have no problem with that.
There's a question from Faith D, and I know we're running close to time, but I want to throw this out there because it does encapsulate some of the other things that we've heard. Should I respond to the Lancaster County Elections Office inquiry about whether I want to vote by mail or in person? I prefer by mail. However, if the mail ballot question isn't resolved before and I vote by mail, could the commissioner suspend my ballot? That's a tough question to answer. I'll leave it either to you, Ray.
Well, I'll answer, Angela. I mean, there are a lot of what ifs that would be ahead of us if, in fact, vote by mail stopped right now before the primary election. One of the things that really was bothersome to me about the timing of the Commonwealth Court ruling that said that they wanted to overturn vote by mail, that's ultimately only going to be decided by the PA Supreme Court. That ruling came out 3 days after the state sent vote by mail application requests via email to everybody on file throughout the state. It was really terrible timing. And Faith is right to be anxious about wondering whether her vote will be counted. The problem, of course, is that if Faith returns a ballot, because we do not have pre-canvassing, which every county election director, I'm sure Commissioner Sapir could speak to this, would like to have, because the legislature has also held that issue hostage because of the relitigating of the 2020 election and the vote by mail issues. Because of that, we're now in a position where, yes, maybe the Lancaster County Board of Elections could open up your envelope and your secret private envelope to find your name, Faith, or figure out who you are. That will, of course, spur more lawsuits that will just raise more questions about the process of the election. That's why I'm fairly confident that the PA Supreme Court will make sure that there's not a final ruling until after the primary. That would be the mature and responsible thing to do to make sure that no one has their vote invalidated because of legal and political arguments that are happening outside of our year after year need to have a sustainable democracy in the state of Pennsylvania. I would vote by mail, but I would be taking a risk, is the answer to Faith's question.
There's no guarantee. And
no guarantee.
And I did want to note for the audience that arguments on this case before the Supreme Court are scheduled for next month, and that generally the court does not act fast, but is expected to make a decision fairly swiftly in this case. And I also wanted to tell everybody, the panelists in the audience, that I'm going to petition for a part 2 of this webinar because it's been very informative and very interesting. But unfortunately, our time, this is all we have time for today. So I want to thank our 3 panelists for taking the time to talk to us about this very important issue. It is greatly appreciated. And I also want to thank everyone in our virtual audience for being here this past hour and for your support of our work. You can find more of our content on spotlightpa.org, and be sure to follow us on Twitter @SpotlightPA. I want to wish everybody a great evening. And again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Possible.